Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for this part of the session. It's really gratifying to see this particular group engaged in this issue and interested in getting it out to the wider world. I also just want to share my gratitude to the organizers for tackling this. As Sunshine suggested, this is nearly an impossible thing that we're going to try to do, but I think we'll impart, some really useful stuff. And the thing that's sort of vexing about resilience is that now, as climate change is getting some increasing news coverage, we're beginning to hear the term resilience more and more frequently. And we, the American public in general, seems to like this term, polling suggests, and we're sort of going with it in an uncritical way. And I feel like you all have the ability to help us take a hard look at what this means. If we're going to be investing our hopes for the future and our precious tax dollars in a resilience push in the years to come, we ought to really understand what we're talking about here. So I'm hoping to help a little bit with that. I don't want you, however, to be misled by the title of my presentation. I don't intend to leave you with an understanding of resilience. I was playing actually with snarky subtitles like Understanding Resilience in 72 Short Hours or Good Luck. But I am going to try to sort of take you along on my pathway toward understanding resilience a bit better. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we run into when we try and look for resilience out there in the world, the real world. Talk a bit about a conceptual framework that I find helpful for trying to make sense of it. And also propose maybe some hard questions that we should be asking of things that propose to be resilient solutions to climate change. I'm going to have to do this briefly. I'm hoping we can save some of the discussion for Q&A so that I can make room for my colleagues. So I promised to use hardly any text in this presentation, but we do need to start with a sort of brass tacks. So here is the popular definition of resilience, and you see some familiar things, right? Something bad happens, we get back to being strong and healthy, we're pulled and stretched, but we get back to our original shape. This is sort of what comes to mind for us when we think of resilience. And this is the IPCC's most recent definition of resilience, and it is a loftier thing, for sure. This definition talks about the capacity of social systems. It talks about coping not just with a hazardous event like a storm, but also trends, long-term trends and disturbances. So not just storm surge, but maybe gradual sea level rise, the whole sort of waterfront of issues, if you will. And then maintaining the capacity for transformation. So, big, lofty stuff, which is good, which is really very important. But this is hard to point to in the real world. So what is resilience? I'm starting here in Salem, Massachusetts. It happens to be the town that I grew up in. It could be your town, it could be any town, basically. I just want to ask, so how do we explore this question in a given setting? And I think if you were to ask folks of Salem, Massachusetts, they would say, well, who are you asking? Whose resilience? And really resilience to what, right? So if we were asking an ecologist, they would say, well, I'm really interested in the resilience of this wetland, this marsh system down here to gradual sea level rise. Can it keep up? If we asked an engineer, they'd say, I'm really interested in the resilience of this rail system to extreme events. Or the power plant with storm surge and flooding, do we have to worry about grid reliability? If I were the mayor, I'd be concerned about the commercial and tourism district. If I were a historian, I'd be worried about the House of Seven Gables, right? And the wharf there and other landmarks. If somebody who's working on social policy wants to know how one neighborhood is going to fare in an extreme heat event versus another. So who are we asking? Whose resilience are we talking about, and resilience to what? Just gives you a sense of how broad this subject is that we're grappling with, right? So it's a really important undertaking to try to understand resilience when we see it, to try and elevate it and celebrate it and really replicate it, get it out there in the world. But I'd suggest that when you dial back from looking at something very specific, it's hard to see resilience in the units that we want to look at, like my community or the Everglades. These are very complex questions. Resilience isn't really an action that is easy to measure, it's a state, right? Which makes it that much more complex. So this is Miami, and we could say, well, Miami is extremely vulnerable, Miami Beach rather, is extremely vulnerable to coastal flooding. Well, that may be true. It may be very vulnerable to storm surge. It may be very resilient over the next 30 years to sea level rise and increased tidal flooding, because Miami happens to be a wealthy community that's able to install 80, Jennifer, you can correct me, 80-something pumps and keep water off the street for a certain amount of time. So the specific metrics really do shape our perception of this. The coasts of New York and New Jersey, if you had asked them a few years ago, are you resilient to storm surge, they probably would have had a pretty different perspective than they do today. After suffering the catastrophic damage of Hurricane Sandy, you know, there's been this eye-opening experience about the chasm, the yawning gap of resilience. The electricity sector in Texas would have felt itself pretty resilient to stressors, and yet a drought came along in around 2011, and it had to shut down this power plant because there wasn't enough water for cooling. We wouldn't have had much basis for saying that the forests of the Rocky Mountains were not resilient to stressors, and yet a beetle infestation wiped out 46 million acres, an area almost the size of Colorado. Communities living in the urban wildland interface tend not to think of themselves as terribly vulnerable to wildfire until we've seen these increase in wildfire events, the extent and the intensity of them, and when homes are lost, people have to question whether it's worth it to rebuild. And of course, California would have said, yeah, we do have a drought problem, but I don't think they would have characterized the urgency and the depth and the lack of resilience quite the way that they would today if you'd asked them a couple of years ago. So my point is really that we understand resilience best in its absence, right? It's hard to know resilience when you see it. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about one way to think about all this, just kind of a conceptual framework. So stick with me on the coasts here. So I would suggest that some of the recent major catastrophic events, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, the drought in California, have really opened up the perspective of millions of Americans to this idea that we face this, we exist with this resilience gap. We are not resilient to these stressors. And actually, the risks that we face and the absence of resilience is far greater than we realized. So when we want to think about closing the resilience gap, the activity that we are talking about, the activity that Kathy was talking about, the first sort of line of defense is adaptation. We're really getting serious about adaptation as a country, and we're intending to invest, hopefully, significant resources over decades to come to start to narrow this resilience gap. So if we're serious about doing that, I hope we can ask some critical questions. So when we think about adaptation, and Kathy, if you covered this, just wave your hand. But when we think about adaptation, there tend to be kind of three major buckets of activity that we can engage in. We can defend against the risk that we face. So here's an example of building seawalls in the aftermath of Sandy along the coast of New York. We can defend against storm surge. We can accommodate, so we can say we're going to live with more water, so let's sort of lift up our skirts and let the water wash in and wash out, and we want to stay in place, we're just going to find ways to accommodate it. Or we can decide, you know, it's not really worth it, we're going to do what Norfolk did with this coastal park that was flooding too often, we're going to retreat, we're going to say, we're going to give it back to the ocean essentially. So if those are the three main approaches, I feel like we've reached a point with adaptation where we're serious enough. I mean, we're all here to learn about it, to talk about it, to bring it back to our communities and try and make it real. We're serious enough that we're really trying to galvanize support for it. And I'm hoping that we can bring also, when we talk about actions under the umbrella of resilience, a certain amount of scrutiny to the decisions that we make. So I just proposed, and I proposed this, I wouldn't normally propose this to an audience, but I propose this because if you're out there in the world and you're learning about a new effort to build resilience, there are some important questions we ought to be asking. Is it based on sound science? Louisiana is looking for $50 billion for a coastal restoration project. And whether those activities are fit for the kind of sea level rise that Louisiana is going to see I think is up for debate at this point. So asking those sorts of questions are extremely valuable. Are we considering the risks and benefits of adaptation measures? So here's a seawall that went in. It's going to require millions of dollars worth of sand replenishment over its lifetime every couple of years. And it has the potential to cause damage up the coast and down the coast based on increased wave action. So also, is it contributing? Is it ensuring fairness and equity? When we bring adaptation measures, resilience building measures to bear, are we ensuring that these are fair outcomes? That those that are paying in and getting something out of this are seeing that done in an equitable way? Are decisions being made with those communities that are being affected as opposed to for those communities affected? And are these things being done in a way that really deliberately try to minimize harm to those that aren't at the table, don't have a voice at the table? And then just to bring in the economic dimensions, are we making decisions that just rely on basic common sense? Are we putting measures in place that aim for resilience under different scenarios, so we're not really tied? This is not a brittle approach to adaptation, but something that's more supple and resilient. Are we weighing the cost of action versus inaction? It's easy to say, oh my God, this thing costs a fortune, we can't do it. But you pay $1 in disaster prevention today, and you save 4 down the road is the sort of commonly touted metric. So just basic, but potentially hard questions to ask of real projects out there that don't necessarily deserve the extremely scarce resources that we have. We're talking about long-lived measures when we talk about really investing in adaptation, and we ought to get it right the first time around, or not do it. And then lastly, I want to talk just briefly about the limits to building resilience through adaptation. So here's Queens. We're not going to elevate Queens. We're not going to build a wall up and down the entire eastern seaboard, although it is discussed. And we don't want to retreat. We'd like to stay here. So what are we going to do about it? We like Louisiana, frankly. And Louisiana is not equipped for the kind of sea level rise that we would see with unmitigated climate change, and neither is Bangladesh. So in addition to closing the resilience gap with adaptation, we need to get serious about mitigation. And I bring this up because I really hope that every time we talk about resilience building, we can fold in the mitigation dimension, because they are so intrinsically connected here. We can work like crazy. We can invest everything we've got in adaptation over the next 30, 40 years. And we can work on narrowing that gap from this side. And it will widen from the other side with unmitigated climate change. So we need to bring mitigation in a serious way into this equation and ideally narrow that resilience gap. We're not going to close it. We're never going to be perfectly resilient to climate stressors and climate risks, but we could hope to narrow it by being serious about investments in both of these dimensions. Right now we're not on the right track. There are many, although I will say 214 emissions were actually lower than they were estimated to be, which is that little sliver of great news in the climate world, which we're just clinging to. Lots of pathways we could take. We need to be on these. We need to be on these lower pathways. And when you hear about resilience building measures, I don't mean to beat up on Louisiana, but it's the one that comes to mind. The $50 billion for coastal restoration. Well, we should also be asking about our fossil fuel emissions. We should be asking about that industry sort of in the same breath, so that we're not throwing good money after bad, investing in adaptation while swamping our investments with unmitigated climate change. I guess just to close up, I think resilience can be achieved. I think narrowing the resilience gap is achievable when we decide not just what we don't want, but over the long term, what we do want. So we're sort of back on our heels at this point, and I think this getting to know resilience, getting comfortable with resilience is beneficial if it drives us to think longer term about the visions for our communities. So we know communities are going to need to change in light of climate change, right? This is the Rebuild by Design process, and just one of the projects that was went through the design phase, looking at how to fortify Manhattan against future storm surge. And so it wasn't just intended to build a big wall. The idea is to create something better. The world's changing, so what do we want it to look like? We want it to be more than it is today. We want to transform and take it to the next level. So this is a berm system, which actually is a beautiful place to be and to spend your time. So when I think about resilience, is our goal to sort of take it on the chin and stay standing, or is our goal really something bigger? Is it to, to say, okay, we wish we hadn't let climate change out of the bag, but we have. So we're going to mitigate like hell. And when we think about adaptation, we're going to do what we need to do in the long term, and we're going to, in the near term, and we're going to build for this longer term, which is a place where we don't just, survive and are back on our heels, but we're really thriving. Thank you.